The chamber was built to make everyone feel small. That was not an accident. The conclave chamber of Velhara had been designed by the Athani 3,000 years ago, and the Athani had a philosophy about power that the room holding a conversation should remind every participant exactly how little they mattered in the scale of the universe. The ceiling was 300 meters of living crystal, growing slowly over centuries, recording every word ever spoken beneath it in permanent light. The walls curved inward like cupped hands. The floor was a single slab of dark stone quarried from a dead planet, polished until it reflected everything. Delegate Marin Solis had stood in this room 14 times. She had never felt smaller than she did right now. She was a tall woman, dark-haired, with the particular stillness of someone who had learned long ago that showing emotion in political spaces was the same as handing your opponent a weapon. She stood at the Earth delegation's podium, a low plain structure compared to the carved columns of the older species, and she kept her face flat and her hands loose at her sides. Around her, in tiered seating that rose toward that impossible ceiling, 31 species waited. Some of them had attended in person. Crystalline bodies, gaseous forms contained in floating tanks, beings that looked vaguely insectoid, and beings that looked disturbingly close to human, and beings that looked like nothing that had ever existed on Earth. Others attended through projection, shimmer images of delegates who were physically thousands of light years away, their homeworlds too distant for comfortable travel, but close enough in interest to send a representative. The Council of Worlds had been operating for 6,000 years. Earth had been a member for 43, the youngest species in the room by a factor of 10. Solis thought about that sometimes, about how it felt to sit in meetings where the oldest members had civilizations older than human agriculture, where the minor procedural debates referenced events that happened before Rome. Earth's delegates had spent their first decade just learning the etiquette, the second decade learning which alliances mattered, the third decade learning to speak. She had been proud of how fast they learned. She was remembering that pride now, the way you remember a meal before a long hunger. And the primary chair belonged to High Delegate Orvan of the Velharan host species, an imposing figure in blue ceremonial robes with a long angular face and pale reflective eyes that made Velharans look permanently thoughtful. He was not thoughtful. Solis had spent enough time in rooms with him to know that he had made up his mind about today's proceedings before he ever entered the chamber. He cleared his throat. The sound carried perfectly in that engineered space. The matter before this council, Orvan said, in the trade language that all members used for official proceedings, concerns the actions of Earth survey vessel Persistence and the formal response of this body to those actions. Solis kept her hands loose. The Persistence. She knew every detail of what had happened, because she had been the one who filed the original complaint on Earth's behalf, and filing it had required understanding it down to the bone. 6 months ago, the Persistence was running a standard geological survey of the Keth Corridor, a stretch of unmapped space that the Council had licensed to a corporation called Varantes Holdings for mineral extraction. Varantes had a clean record. They paid their licensing fees. They operated within Council regulations for presentient zone extraction, which meant they were authorized to mine planets and moons and asteroids in regions where no recognized sentient life had been detected. The Persistence found the Drev. The Drev were a fungal species, organized in colony structures across 17 connected cave systems on the third moon of a gas giant that Varantes had already begun boring into from the other side. The Council's automated survey drones had passed through Drev territory 12 years earlier and logged the life forms as Class 4 biological, non-cognitive. The classification was based on the standard cognition tests. No tool use detected, no structured acoustic communication, no evidence of social hierarchy beyond basic biological organization. The Council's tests looked for minds that thought the way Council species thought. The Drev did not think that way. They communicated in chemical memory chains, complex sequences of molecular signals that encoded not just information, but experience, passed between colony members through physical contact. As they did not use sound. They did not build tools in any form a scanner would recognize. What they built was memory, layered and shared, a living archive of their entire history stored in the biological structure of the colony itself. Dr. Yuki Adeyemi, the Persistence's xenobiologist, had spent 11 weeks figuring this out. She was 29 years old and had never made first contact with anything before. She described the process later, in testimony that Solace had read 6 times, as learning to listen with my skin. She had developed a crude chemical vocabulary by trial and observation. She had spent nights lying on the cave floor, with sensors taped to her arms, trying to understand what the Drev were saying to her. What they were saying mostly was, "You are vibrating wrong, but we are curious about you." When Adeyemi finally understood enough to communicate back, the first complete exchange took 4 hours and left her weeping in her bunk. She never fully explained why. Her report simply noted that the Drev had shown her a memory. Their memory of the drilling, of the sound it made, of how deep it reached. Adeyemi filed her findings. The Persistence filed a formal complaint against Verantis Holdings for extraction in a zone containing sentient life. Earth's diplomatic office, meaning Solace, forwarded the complaint to the Council's Ethics and Classification Review Board. That had been 4 months ago. What Solace had not fully understood at the time she filed was that the Ethics Board was chaired by a species called the Mur, who held 3 commercial licensing agreements with Verantis Holdings. She understood it now. The actions of Earth's survey vessel, Orvan continued, his voice carrying that particular bureaucratic rhythm that made devastating things sound like routine maintenance, constituted an unauthorized contact event with a Council-classified non-sentient species. This contact was conducted without Council clearance, without observer oversight, and in a zone under active commercial license. The resulting complaint filing was therefore invalid at the point of origin, as it was generated by an unauthorized contact. He paused. Furthermore, the contact itself represents a violation of Council Treaty Article 7, Section 3, which prohibits member species from acting unilaterally in contested or licensed zones. Solace had known this was coming. She had known since the Ethics Board's response came back in 48 hours. A record time, for a board that usually took 6 months. She had known when 3 council members who had previously been friendly to Earth's delegations suddenly became unavailable for meetings. She had still hoped she was wrong. She was not wrong. "This council has reviewed the matter," Orvan said. "A motion has been brought for suspension of Earth's membership pending formal review." The vote took 11 minutes. 31 votes cast, 30 in favor of suspension. Earth's 1 vote against did not count. Suspended members lost their voting rights at the moment the motion was called, which was a procedural rule that Solis had read about once and filed away as a theoretical curiosity. It was not theoretical anymore. "Earth's membership in the Council of Worlds is hereby suspended," Orvan said. "Watch trade access through council-managed routes is revoked. Communication relay access is suspended. All shared infrastructure agreements are paused pending review." A formal review hearing has been scheduled. He named a date, 40 years from today. A small sound escaped someone in the Earth delegation's gallery. Just one. Quickly swallowed. Solis did not make a sound. She stood at her podium and looked at Orvan and at the 30 members who had just voted, and she felt something moving through her. Not rage exactly, and not grief exactly, but something with the temperature of both, moving like cold water behind her sternum. She had one question. Protocol allowed a suspended delegate 1 statement of record before the chamber closed. She leaned toward the podium's voice receiver. What do you call a species that develops language you cannot hear?" Her voice was level, perfectly level. No one answered. Orvan's expression did not change. Around the chamber, 31 species, some of the oldest civilizations in the known galaxy, sat in silence under 300 meters of recording crystal. Solace waited 5 seconds. Then she gathered her materials, turned, and walked out. The Earth delegation's transport was a mid-range diplomatic vessel called the Constance, docked in Bay 17 of Velhara's government port. It was a good ship, comfortable, well-maintained, painted in Earth's diplomatic colors of deep blue and white. It looked embarrassingly small next to the council members' vessels, which was something Solace had grown used to over the years. She walked up the boarding ramp without looking back at the port. Her aide, a young man named Dario, who had been with the delegation for 2 years, was waiting just inside the airlock. He had clearly been watching the chamber feed. His face was doing the thing young faces do when they encounter something they have no framework for, a kind of blankness that was actually just processing time. "Delegate," he started. "Give me 10 minutes, Sully said. Not unkindly, just a fact. She went to the small private communications room at the back of the ship, sat down, stared at the wall for a while. The wall was gray and unremarkable, and she found this helpful. She thought about the Drev, about Adeyemi lying on a cave floor learning to listen with her skin, about the memory the Drev had shared, the sound of drilling reaching down. She thought about 40 years, a review hearing in 40 years. Earth's youngest current diplomat was 24. They would be 64 when the hearing happened, if the council held to the schedule, which they would not, because bureaucracies like the council ran on convenience, and delay was always more convenient than resolution. She thought about the Drev colony on that moon, and about Varantis Holdings, and about the drill still running. She pulled up the communications console. The relay blackout would hit in approximately 6 hours, when council technical teams revoked Earth's access codes. After that, any transmission between Earth and Velhara would travel at light speed, meaning months each way. The relay network was the thing that made the council a community, rather than just a collection of isolated civilizations. And without it, Earth would be an island. She had 6 hours. She composed a transmission to Admiral Yara Osei at Earth's Unified Defense Command. Not because Osei was her closest ally. They were not close exactly. They were two people who had read the same threat assessments and arrived at the same conclusions independently, which was a different kind of trust than friendship. The message was 2 words. "We're alone." She sent it. Then she went to find Dario and tell him to prepare the delegation for departure. The transmission arrived at Earth Defense Command at 0340 hours local time. Admiral Yara Osei was not asleep. She was rarely asleep at 0340 hours. She was at her desk, reading quarterly maintenance reports for the Third Fleet, which was the kind of work that required just enough attention to keep her mind from going to places she preferred not to visit in the dark. She was a broad-shouldered woman in her 50s, with short gray-streaked hair and the economical movements of someone who had spent decades learning that wasted motion was wasted time. Her face was not unkind, but it was not warm in any way that was immediately obvious. Warmth took knowing her, and not many people did. She read the 2-word message. She set it down. She picked up her coffee, drank the last of it, which was cold, set the cup down. Then she opened the bottom drawer of her desk, the left side, the deep one, and took out a folder. Physical paper, an affectation she had never quite shed. The folder was thick, slightly worn at the corners, and labeled in her own handwriting with a code designation. Contingency 7. It had been sitting in that drawer for 9 years. She had updated it herself every 2 years, adding new data and revised projections. The way you maintain something you hope you will never use and cannot afford to leave outdated. She opened it. The first page was a cover sheet with a single line of text, the words of the game theorist who had written the original document in 2089, 20 years before Osei was born. If they ever make us leave, make sure leaving was their mistake. Osei read that line. She had read it many times. It had never felt like the present tense before. She picked up her desk comm and woke up 3 people who were going to have a very difficult morning. Outside the window of her office, Earth's lights were spread across the dark below. Cities and coastlines in the slow curve of the planet's horizon, catching the first gray edge of dawn. She watched it for a moment before she started making calls. 43 years as a council member. She had been a junior officer when Earth joined. She remembered the ceremonies, the pride, the feeling that humanity had finally arrived somewhere that mattered, that the long, difficult work of reaching space had been rewarded with a place at the table. She had also, from very early, noticed how far from the head of the table that place was. She had not said this out loud. She was not someone who said things out loud that were better used as preparation. She had simply watched and read and updated a folder every 2 years, and waited to see whether the thing she was preparing for would ever arrive. It had arrived. She turned from the window and started making calls. Down in Bay 7 of the lunar shipyard, the lights were already on. Kovacs Dren had been on shift since yesterday morning. He rarely left the yard during active construction phases, sleeping in a cot in the supervisor's office and eating whatever his crew brought him. He was 61 years old and had been building ships for 35 of those years, and he still got up from his cot at the sound of his comm like someone half his age. He read Osei's message, read it twice, looked out the office window at the construction floor, where 3 partially built vessels sat in their cradles under the yellow work lights. All the ordinary projects of an ordinary defense budget. And he thought about what Contingency 7 said about shipbuilding requirements. He thought about the yard's current capacity. He thought about which of those projects could be repurposed and which ones would need to be completely rethought. He put on his boots and went down to the floor. His foreman, a woman named Chen, who had worked with him for 12 years, looked up from a console. "Something changed?" she asked. She could read him. "Everything," he said. He picked up a marking tool and walked to the nearest wall, where a large schematic of the current build plan was posted. He studied it for a moment. "We're going to need bigger fuel tanks," he said. Chen waited. "And we're going to need a lot of them." He started marking the schematic. "Kaksha, wake up whoever's sleeping and tell them the schedule changed." "Changed to what?" He thought about the folder, about what it said Earth would need if it was ever really alone, about the 14 colony worlds that were, as of 6 hours from now, at the end of a supply chain that no longer connected to anything. "Tell them," he said, "that we're building for a long trip." Back in the conclave chamber of Velhara, the crystal ceiling was still growing. It grew slowly, a few centimeters per century. But it grew, permanently recording everything said beneath it in its molecular structure, layer by layer, the full history of 6,000 years of galactic governance stored in light and stone. Solace's question was in there now. 2 sentences, recorded forever in the most permanent archive in the known galaxy. What do you call a species that develops language you cannot hear? The chamber was empty. The delegates had gone to their post-session dinners and their private meetings and the ordinary continuation of council life that a suspension vote barely interrupted. The crystal grew. Outside in Bay 17, the Constance powered up its drives. The crew ran through departure checks. Dario stood at the rear viewport and watched the lights of Velhara's government port slide past as they moved toward open space. Solace sat in the communications room until the relay blackout hit. Right on schedule, 6 hours after the vote. One moment the board showed green, the next it showed gray. Every route, every frequency. The quiet, immediate amputation of 43 years of connection. She sat with the gray board for a while. Then she went to the bridge. "Crew, take us home," she said. The Constance turned toward a star that looked exactly like every other star from this distance. It was 3 months away at standard speed. Through space, they no longer had permission to cross quickly. They crossed it anyway. The first thing that ran out was medicine. Not all medicine. Not immediately. But 43 of the treatments that Earth's hospitals used every day were built on synthesis patents licensed through Council pharmaceutical networks. And when the access codes went gray, the automated supply chain simply stopped. No ships came. No orders processed. The hospitals had stockpiles, some of them deep enough to last months, some of them thin enough to cause problems inside a week. Osei got the full report on her desk 8 days after the ban. She read it without expression, which was her way, and then she forwarded it to 6 people with a note that said, "Priority 1. Don't come back to me with problems. Come back with a plan." The plan that came back from a biochemist at the Cape Town Research Institute who had apparently been ready for exactly this scenario was to reverse engineer every affected treatment from first principles, which was technically a violation of several council patents. Osei forwarded the plan to Earth's Legal Review Office with a second note. "Tell me if this is illegal." Legal came back in 4 hours. Technically, yes, but they'd have to show up to enforce it. Osei wrote back, "Start the synthesis." That was how the first 18 months went, problem by problem, each one requiring someone to look at a rule, note who was supposed to enforce the rule, realize that the enforcer was no longer speaking to them, and proceed. It was not heroic work. It was relentless, grinding, practical work. The kind of work that does not appear in history books because it happened in labs and logistics offices and shipyard planning rooms at 3 in the morning. But it was also the work that kept 14 colony worlds from going dark. The 14 colonies were the immediate crisis underneath the crisis. Earth had been colonizing for 60 years, and the colony worlds, some as close as 2 light years, some as far as 30, had always depended on council-managed trade routes for supply shipments, food supplements, equipment parts, medical stores. The routes were fast, cheap, and maintained by an infrastructure that covered most of explored space like a circulatory system. Now, being cut off from it was not like being cut off from a trade network. It was like a blood vessel being tied off. 3 colonies were already on emergency rationing by the time Kovac's first mule ships came out of the lunar yard. The mules were not beautiful. Kovac had never particularly cared about beautiful. He cared about whether a thing held together under pressure, and whether it did what it was supposed to do, and whether the people inside it came home. The mules were wide-bodied cargo haulers with fuel tanks so oversized they looked like someone had bolted them on as an afterthought, which was accurate. The interiors were stripped to basics. Crew quarters, systems room, cargo hold as deep as he could make it. The drives were the most reliable design Earth had, upgraded with a fuel efficiency system that his head engineer had developed from scratch over 3 sleepless weeks. They were slow. Slower than Council route ships, which used relay-assisted travel to cover distance faster than conventional drive systems allowed. They went anyway. The routes they had to use were the long paths, through unmapped stretches of space that the Council had never bothered to chart because the highways made charting unnecessary. Some of those paths ran close to zones listed in old Council surveys as hazard-class transit areas, which was a designation that could mean anything from mild radiation variants to genuinely catastrophic spatial anomalies. Kovac's crews memorized every hazard log that existed. They also knew going in that most of those logs were incomplete. The Council surveys had been quick passes. When Earth's pilots would be going slower and learning as they went. Before the first convoy launched, Osei called the crew commanders into a room in the lunar facility's briefing level. There were 12 of them. They ranged in age from 26 to 52. All military, all volunteers. She did not give them a speech. She stood at the front of the room and looked at them for a moment, and then she said, "The colonies need what you're carrying. You'll have no relay communication on the long stretches. You'll be making navigation calls in the dark. Some of those calls will be wrong and you'll have to correct them in real time." She paused. "I need you to come back." She said it simply, like a request, not an order. The 12 commanders looked at her. "We will," one of them said. Her name was Petra Voss. She was 26. Once she commanded the lead mule on the first convoy, a ship she had named Dogged, which her crew thought was strange until they understood she meant it as a compliment. The Gassari were the accident. Or rather, the meeting was an accident. The Gassari themselves were very much on purpose. They had been a functioning civilization for 2,000 years before their Council exile, and they had spent the 4 decades since their exile being purposeful in ways that the Council preferred to ignore. Petra Voss found them on the 3rd week of the Dogged's first run, which was not a good week. If the convoy had lost communication with its trailing ship for 6 hours due to an electromagnetic dead zone that no survey had charted, the ship reappeared on the other side intact but badly rattled. And Voss had been awake for 31 consecutive hours by the time the Gassari vessel appeared on scan. It was a mid-sized transport, long and pale, with a swept-back architecture that Voss didn't recognize because Council technical databases classified Gassari's ship design under restricted access. Exiled entity. The ship was broadcasting a standard distress frequency. Voss was not required to respond. The distress frequency was a Council network signal, and Earth was no longer on the network, and she had a cargo hold full of medical supplies for a colony 3 weeks away that was already sick. She responded anyway. Once the Gassari captain's name was a sequence of tones that Voss's translator rendered as Sivari, and she looked like nothing so much as a large hawk that had learned to stand upright and wear a flight suit. Dark-feathered, yellow-eyed, with a beak designed for a diet that had nothing in common with human food. She was also clearly expecting to be turned away. The Gassari had been turned away a lot in 40 years. Voss looked at the damage report that Sivari transmitted. A drive component failure, fixable with parts that the Gassari ship didn't carry spare. The kind of failure that, in the middle of unmapped space without council relay access could become permanent. "Do you need food or fuel first?" Voss asked. Sivari's yellow eyes blinked. Her translator worked in both directions. "I need the drive component," she said. "I know. But the drive component is going to take my engineer 4 hours to fabricate and install. While she does that, food or fuel?" A pause, long enough that Voss wondered if she had said something wrong, if there was a cultural gap her translator hadn't flagged. "Fuel," Sivari said finally. "We have food. The children have enough." Children. Voss noted that. She also noted that the Gassari ship was running on reserve power, which meant everything not essential to life support was dark. "Fuel first," she told her crew. "Then Mira starts on the component." Her engineer, a compact Mongolian woman named Mira, who communicated mostly in size and technical terminology, started on the component without being asked again. The 4 hours it took were not comfortable. Voss didn't know the Gassari. The Gassari didn't know Earth's current situation. Both ships sat in the dark of unmapped space with their docking collars joined, and Voss brewed coffee in the dogged small galley and tried to think of something to say that wasn't awkward. She settled on the truth. She told Sivari about the ban, about the council vote, about the 14 colonies and the mule convoys and the 9-year-old folder that Admiral Osei had been updating while hoping she'd never need it. Sivari listened without interrupting. When Voss finished, the Gassari captain said, 40 years ago, the council classified our central nesting territories as a restricted zone for reasons they have never published. We appealed. They scheduled a review." She paused. "We are still waiting." They looked at each other through the comm screen. "How many of your people are in exile?" Voss asked. 3 million? It distributed across 11 systems. We have 6 ships of this class. We trade where we can. We build what we need." Sivari tilted her head slightly. The hawk-like gesture that Voss would later learn meant something between consideration and interest. "Your people are just starting." "Yes. It is harder than you think it will be." "I know." "You don't yet," Sivari said, not unkindly. "But you will." Mira finished the component. The Gassari drive came back online. Sivari flew her people out of the dead zone and back toward whatever route she'd been running. Before the docking collars separated, she transmitted a data package to the Dogged's navigation system. It contained charts, rough, hand-developed, not council standard, but detailed, of the long routes through 11 unmapped systems that the Gassari had been flying for 40 years. Voss looked at the data for a long moment. She sent a message ahead to Earth on the slow, light-speed frequency that was all they had now. "Made a friend. See attached." Marin Solis was not on Earth for any of this. She had gone home after the Constance completed its 3-month crawl back from Velhara. She had given her report to the Crisis Council. She had answered questions for a week. She had eaten dinner at her mother's house and slept for 14 hours and then gone back to work. Her work had changed. Her official title was still delegate, though the role had no external function anymore. There was no council to delegate to. What she actually did in the months following the ban was harder to name. She read. She researched. She went back through council records going back decades, looking for every case file, every classification dispute, every appeal that had been filed and delayed or denied. The list was long. She cross-referenced it with current intelligence on where those species were now. Exiled, restricted, classified, minimized. Some had disappeared entirely from galactic records, which could mean they had died out, or could mean the council had stopped tracking them, and either answer was grim. 3 months after the ban, Osei found her in a requisitioned office in the Nairobi Administrative Complex, surrounded by data screens and the particular organized chaos of someone deep in a project. "You're going back," Osei said. It was not a question. "Someone has to," Solly said. "The council will have your name flagged, but you won't be able to travel as an Earth representative." "I know." Solis pulled up a file on her screen. "The Gassari have a transit network. They owe us one after the drive repair. They can get me documentation that says I'm a civilian cargo consultant." Osei looked at her. "That's technically espionage," Osei said. "It's technically travel," Solis said. "The espionage part is what I do after I get there." Osei was quiet for a moment. She had known Solace for 7 years, which was long enough to understand that certain conversations were not negotiations but announcements. "What are you looking for?" Osei asked. Solace pulled up a map on the central screen, a map of council space, dotted with markers, yellow for restricted species, orange for exiled ones, red for ones that had vanished from records. When there were more than Osei had realized, more than Osei had thought about. "Everyone they've ever left behind," Solace said. Osei looked at the map. "That's a lot of people," she said. "Yes," Solace said. "It is." The council's envoy arrived 8 months after the ban. He was a junior administrator named Peleth. Mid-rank, young enough that Osei suspected he had been chosen partly because he was replaceable if the meeting went badly. He came in a single small diplomatic vessel, broadcasting civilian identification codes, and he requested a formal meeting through Earth's defense communication system as if the defense communication system had been waiting for his call. Osei gave him a meeting because she wanted to know what the offer was. They sat in a conference room at the Lunar Administrative Facility. A plain room, functional chairs, a table that was slightly too large for 2 people. Osei sat on one side. Peleth sat on the other, with the careful posture of someone trying not to show how much the gravity difference was bothering him. Vel-Heron-born species tended to run light. Earth's gravity was always an adjustment. Peleth laid out the offer over 30 minutes. He was well prepared and he delivered it cleanly. Earth's suspension quietly reversed. Trade route access restored. Medical synthesis licenses renewed. The Drev complaint withdrawn. A small fine paid. The violation formally acknowledged. In exchange, Earth returned to the Council as a member in good standing, and the whole incident was filed away under the category of procedural resolution. The Drev would remain classified as they were. Verantis Holdings would continue its extraction. Peleth did not say this last part out loud. He didn't need to. Osei listened to all of it. She drank her coffee, warm this time, and she listened without interrupting, which she could do when she chose to. When Peleth finished, she set her cup down. 8 months ago, she said, "This offer would have been very useful to us." Peleth waited. "My shipyard has built 43 mule-class cargo vessels in the last 8 months. My crews have charted 11 systems that your surveys missed. I have 200 chemists producing 8 of the 43 treatments your patents covered, with 5 more in development." She folded her hands on the table. "My colonies are not healthy yet, but they are not dying." Peleth's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes shifted slightly. "We used to need this offer," Osei said. "To check back in 10 years and see where we are." A long silence. "Admiral," Peleth said carefully, "the Council is prepared to be patient, but the review hearing in 40 years is a formal proceeding. If Earth is not a member when that hearing occurs, then Earth won't be at the hearing," Osei said. "We'll be somewhere else." She stood up. The meeting was over. Peleth left in his small ship and filed his report, and the Council read the report, and the Council's Intelligence Division added a note to Earth's file that said posture, uncooperative, motivation, unclear. The motivation was not unclear, but the Council had not been listening closely enough to understand it, which was, Osei thought, entirely in keeping with everything that had come before. She went back to her desk, back to the maintenance reports and the shipyard projections, and the slow, grinding, relentless work of building something from nothing in the space that a door had left when it slammed shut. It was not dramatic work, but it was real, and every day it looked a little more like it was going to hold. It took Solis 2 years to find all of them. 2 years of traveling under a false name, on Gassari transit papers, through corridors of space that the Council managed but did not monitor closely because they were corridors that only the marginal used. Exiled species, itinerant traders, minor civilizations running routes between systems too small to attract official attention. She was good at being invisible. She had spent her career in rooms where Earth's delegation was the smallest and least senior, which meant she had practiced going unnoticed in places built to notice everyone. That particular skill turned out to be more useful now than anything she had studied in the diplomatic academy. She found the Gassari first, properly this time. Not just Shivari's 3-ship transit circuit, but the full exile community, 3 million people spread across 11 systems, organized with the disciplined efficiency of a species that had learned to survive without infrastructure. They had built what they needed over 40 years: food cultivation systems that worked on marginal worlds, medical practices that used local biology instead of council-licensed compounds, communication networks that ran on frequencies the council's standard scanners didn't flag. When she explained what she was doing, Shivari looked at her for a long moment. "Kina, you want to build something," Shivari said. "Yes," Soli said. "Something that sits next to the council, not under it." "Yes." Another pause. Shivari had a way of going quiet that was not uncertainty. It was calculation, the way a bird of prey holds still before it moves. "Show me what you have written," Shivari said. Solis had written 11 pages. She had started them on the Constance, on the 3-month journey home from Velhara, in the hour after the relay went gray. Not because she had planned to. She had not at that point been thinking about building anything. She had been thinking about the Drev, and about the council's vote, and about the silence in the chamber when she asked her question. She had opened a document to take notes and then kept writing and didn't stop until she had 11 pages. It was not a treaty. It was not a constitution exactly. It was closer to a set of agreements, specific, short, in plain language that any translator could handle without ambiguity. The first article was the one she had thought about most. No member of this compact may classify another species as presentient. The capacity for thought and language is presumed until demonstrated otherwise. The burden of proof rests on the classifier, not the classified. That was the whole article. One paragraph. She had written and rewritten it 50 times to make sure it said only what she meant and nothing else. The council's charter was 9,000 pages. She had read most of it. She had noticed that the longer a governing document was, the more room it contained for the interpretation of inconvenient truths. 11 pages left very little room. Shivari read the pages. While she read them twice, in the way of someone who is checking not just what the words say, but what they do not say. Then she handed them back. "The Gassari will sign," she said. The Theric Syndicate took longer. The Syndicate was not a species in the standard sense. It was a trade consortium of 12 smaller species who had come together 80 years ago out of necessity because none of them individually had enough political weight to hold council membership without constant risk of having their status revised. Together, they held one combined council seat and paid full membership dues, which the larger members had always considered a generous arrangement. The Syndicate considered it something else. The word they used in their trade language translated roughly as a politely arranged boot on the neck. So Solis found the Syndicate's representative council in a commercial way station at the edge of council-managed space. A large busy station built on pure mercantile logic, which meant it was also one of the few places in the galaxy where her Gassari papers did not attract any particular attention. Everyone at the way station was running some kind of paperwork they preferred not to examine too closely. The Syndicate's senior representative was a being called Darvik. He was from one of the Syndicate's founding species. Tall, gray-skinned, with large eyes calibrated for low-light environments, and the careful manners of someone who had spent a long time being the smallest entity in important rooms. He knew exactly what Earth was. He had followed the ban with close attention. "You have been a member for 43 years, he said to Solis, at their first meeting. "We have been members for 80. We have never been treated as members." "I know," Solis said. "The Council's charter gives full members equal representation," Darvik said. "In practice, combined seat members are excluded from emergency sessions, have their proposals reviewed last, and are routinely outvoted by procedural coalitions that form before we are informed a vote is happening." "I know," Solis said again. He looked at her with his large, careful eyes. "You're saying you know because you watched it happen to yourself." "I'm saying I know because I read every complaint your representatives filed in the last 80 years, Solis said. "Every single one. I read what happened to them. And I read the response times and the outcomes and the language the council used." She opened the 11 pages on the table between them. "I also read who filed the most. It was you." Darvik was quiet for a moment. "Equal seats," Solis said. "One species, one vote. No combined classifications, no second-tier membership. Every species that signs gets the same standing as every other species that signs." And if your compact eventually grows large enough that smaller members can be outvoted by larger ones? Darvek asked. It was a reasonable question. It was the question. Then we revisit the charter, Solis said. Together. She paused. I will not pretend I have solved every problem. I will tell you that I wrote this document to be short enough that we can change it when it needs changing. Darvek read the 11 pages. When he asked 11 specific detailed questions that told her he understood exactly what each sentence was doing. She answered all of them directly. The Theric Syndicate will sign, he said at the end, on condition that each of the 12 member species signs individually, not as a combined entity. That was going to be my suggestion, Solis said. That gave the compact, when the signatures were finalized, 13 members from the syndicate species alone. Combined with the Gasari community's 3 distinct regional groupings, it was already a body of 16 before Solis went looking for anyone else. The Vel Nas were not easy to find. They were ancient, the oldest non-council species on Solis's list, with a civilization that predated the council itself by several centuries. They were aquatic, living in the deep ocean systems of a world that sat in a region of space so far off the main trade routes that most council maps labeled it simply as surveyed, no commercial value. They had not spoken to the council in 300 years. The dispute was old enough that the council's current members didn't know the details. Solis had found it buried in archived documents from a period before several of the current member species had even achieved spaceflight. What she pieced together was this. 300 years ago, the Vel Nas had been offered council membership. They had sent a delegation. The delegation had been seated in the visitor gallery, not the member floor, on the grounds that the Vel Nas had not yet demonstrated sufficiently complex infrastructure development by council standards. The infrastructure standard was based on surface construction, building things above water. The Vel Nas built everything beneath it in structures of such complexity that the council's survey team had not recognized them as constructed at all. The Vel Nas delegation had gone home. They had never come back. Solis reached their world through a combination of Gasari navigation charts and a Theric Syndicate contact who had once traded with a species that had once traded with a species that remembered where the Vel Nas were. Communication was genuinely difficult. The Vel Nas used sound and pressure variation in water. Their language carried information in dimensions that air-based communication equipment wasn't built for. The translation work took 3 months. With help from a Gasari linguist and a physicist from Earth's university system who had studied aquatic communication as a theoretical exercise and was overjoyed to discover it had a practical application. When Solis finally got a complete sentence across, the Vel Nas elder she was speaking with, a creature that moved like slow water given intention, lit from within by bioluminescent patterns, was quiet for a long time. Then it said, in translation, "We have been here longer than their charter. We remember what they forgot. We are not asking to join your house. We are telling you we already live in it." Solis wrote that down. "Will you sign?" she asked. The elder moved in a slow pattern that the translation system said meant something close to. "We have been waiting for someone interesting to come along." "We will sign," the elder said. The compact's founding ceremony happened in a converted cargo bay. This was not the setting that any of the founding members had imagined, but it was the practical one. The Gasari way station in Sector 11 was the only place all the represented species could physically reach in a reasonable time, and it had a cargo bay large enough to fit delegations from 31 species, including the environmental support equipment that the Vel Nas required to exist outside water. Kovac Dren, who had come in person because Osei had decided someone with practical judgment needed to be present, stood at the back of the bay and looked at the assembled delegates. He had been building things for 35 years. He had an engineer's way of seeing rooms. He automatically assessed load-bearing points on a structural integrity, the logic of how space was organized. What he saw here was not a room with a structural weakness. What he saw was a thing that had been made from pieces that were never meant to fit together, that fit anyway, because someone had been patient enough to find the joints. Solis stood at the front of the bay, at a plain table with the 11 pages on it. She had asked for no ceremony, no speeches. She knew what long ceremonies did. They created moments that the participants could point to later and say, "That is when we decided." when the truth was that decisions happened much earlier, in small rooms, in careful conversations, over translated languages and shared meals, and the slow work of trust. The ceremony was just the signing. Each delegation came forward in turn. Sir, the Gassari pressed their talons to the document in the physical contact form their tradition required. The Theric syndicates, 12 species, each signed individually as agreed. The Velnos representative left a pressure impression in a medium that Kovacs quietly provided. He had brought a suitable material because Solus had mentioned the aquatic delegation, and he had thought ahead, as he always did. The Drev signed last. Solus had found the Drev 4 months into her travels, still on their moon, still in their cave systems. But the Varantes drilling had stopped, not because of any council action. It had stopped because Varantes' licensing agreement had come up for renewal, and in the 9 months since the Drev complaint was filed and dismissed, someone had quietly circulated the complaint's contents to enough council-adjacent journalists that the renewal had become politically awkward. Varantes had declined to renew, citing operational reorientation. The Drev colony was intact. When Solus arrived, they had been expecting her. She did not know how. She could not fully communicate with the Drev yet. Her vocabulary was still incomplete. But the colony had prepared a reception that, filtered through her translator, felt like being told, "You are the one who spoke for us when no one was listening." She had kept it together until she was back in her ship. The Drev delegates signed by pressing both hands flat against the document for 30 seconds, which was the chemical signature equivalent of a signature in their communication system. The translator noted that the chemical sequence left in the paper included a record of the event itself, what the room smelled like, how many species were present, the particular quality of the light. The document afterward smelled faintly like rain in old libraries. 3 weeks after the signing, a council patrol vessel intercepted a compact convoy in the Lethus corridor, a stretch of space that sat in a gray zone between council-licensed territory and the unmanaged routes the compact used. The convoy was carrying Drev medical compounds to a Gassari colony on the far edge of the compact's network, where an outbreak of a respiratory illness was moving through the population. And the compounds were the only thing that worked on the specific pathogen, a piece of biological knowledge that existed only because the Drev had 3,000 years of medical memory stored in their colony and had shared it with Earth's researchers in the months since contact. The Council Patrol Commander invoked standard procedure: unauthorized transit, unlicensed cargo, detention, and search pending verification. Standard procedure could take weeks. Weeks in which the Gassari colony got sicker. OC was 3 hours away with 2 warships. She had been running escort routes along the compact's outer edges, anticipating exactly this kind of encounter, and she had opinions about what should happen next that involved neither patience nor paperwork. Solus, who was on the convoy flagship, told Osei to hold position. And then she filed an emergency injunction with the Council's Humanitarian Relief Division, a body that had been written into the Council's charter as a check on patrol authority, allowing it to override detentions where there was demonstrable humanitarian need. The provision had last been invoked 62 years ago. Solus had read about it in her archive research and filed it away. She pulled it out now. The injunction filing included the Gassari colony's medical records, a summary of the outbreak timeline, the chemical analysis of the Drev compounds confirming they were medical in nature, and a formal request for expedited processing. The Humanitarian Relief Division was staffed by mid-level administrators who dealt mostly with paperwork and had not been involved in any active intervention since before most of them were born. The injunction landed on a supervisor's desk at the end of his shift. He read it. He approved it. He sent the authorization to the patrol vessel 40 minutes later because the filing was correct in every procedural detail and he could find no grounds to delay it, and because, if he was honest, though he did not write this in his report, the colony records were difficult to read without feeling something. The patrol stood down. The convoy moved. Osei arrived 3 hours later to find the corridor empty and the convoy already on its way. She sat on her bridge for a moment, looking at the open space where a conflict had not happened. Then she opened a comm channel to Solis. "You're terrifying," Osei said. "I know the manual," Solis said. A silence, not uncomfortable. In the kind of silence between two people who have just understood something about each other. All of it? Osei asked. Every clause, Solis said. 9,000 pages. Why? Because one day they were going to use it against us, and I wanted to know it better than they did. Osei closed the channel and went back to her navigation display. Cadet Amara Osei had been assigned to the Compact's Persistence 2, a new survey vessel named with deliberate intent, is part of her officer training rotation. She was 22, second year, with her mother's economy of movement and her own particular way of watching rooms. She was watching Solis when she asked the question. It was evening on the way station's human-calibrated schedule, the cargo bay still faintly chemical with Drev's signature, with a founding document locked in a secure case that Kovac had built himself because he didn't trust anyone else's tolerances. Are we the council now? Amara asked. Just smaller? The question arrived without preamble. Amara had been working up to it for a week, and when she finally said it, it came out flat and direct, which was her mother's way of asking something she genuinely needed an answer to. Solis didn't answer immediately. The pause stretched long enough that Amara wondered if she had said something wrong. But Solis's expression was not bothered. It was thinking. The specific face of someone sitting with the actual weight of a question instead of reaching for the comfortable answer. Ask me again in 5 years, Solis said. I'll know by then. It was not a deflection. Amara understood that much. Yet it was a real answer. The honest acknowledgement that she was watching for the same thing Amara was asking about, and that the watching was not finished. Amara wrote it in her log. She would remember to ask again. The Compact, at the end of its first year, covered 31 systems. It had no fixed capital, no permanent headquarters, and no dedicated military. It had, in place of a military, a mutual defense agreement and a shared patrol network that used each species' existing vessels. It had no name officially. The founding document just said this agreement, and the delegates had been too focused on the substance to argue about what to call it. The name came from the Theric Syndicate's junior representative, a young being named Vreth, who had attended the signing as an observer and whose species did not yet have a seat. She referred to it in a transmission to her home council as the Compact, as in the compact of those who needed one. And the name attached itself and stayed, the way practical names do when the right word arrives at the right moment. The Council's intelligence briefing, when it finally updated Earth's file, classified the Compact as a regional anomaly with limited strategic significance. Someone in that briefing room suggested updating the classification. They were outvoted. The Council finally read its own intelligence briefing. It was a Tuesday in the Council's administrative calendar, which ran on Velharan Standard Time and had no meaningful relationship to any day of the week that Earth recognized. And the briefing had been sitting in the primary committee's pre-session reading list for 2 weeks. 2 weeks was not unusual. And the primary committee received 40 to 60 briefings per standard cycle. And the system for prioritizing them had been designed by a species that thought in century-long increments and was not naturally inclined toward urgency. But someone had moved this briefing to the top of the list, and the committee chair read it and then read it again, and then asked her aide to pull the supporting data. The Compact now covered 31 systems. It had 28 member species, most of them former Council exiles or unrecognized civilizations. Its trade network moved more cargo per month through the long routes than the Council had anticipated was physically possible without relay infrastructure. Its medical research, built partly on Earth's reverse engineering work, partly on Drev biological knowledge, and partly on Gasari pharmaceutical techniques that the Council had classified as proprietary to an exiled entity, and therefore legally inaccessible but practically very much in use, had produced 11 treatments that did not exist anywhere else. The Compact had no official military, but it had 43 Mule-class cargo vessels that had been quietly retrofitted with defensive systems. It had 6 Gasari fast attack ships that could outrun anything the Council fielded. It had Osei, and it had, in the last 6 months, been approached by 7 species that were currently Council members. Minor members, second-tier members, members who paid full dues and sat in the back of the chamber, with quiet inquiries about what joining the Compact would involve. The committee chair set down the briefing. She called a closed session. The closed session used the word compliance action, which was the council's term for a situation requiring military intervention to restore order in its jurisdiction. The Lethis corridor, where the compact's routes ran, was technically in council-adjacent space, and the humanitarian injunction had created a precedent that the legal division was uncomfortable with. Several more patrol interceptions had been attempted in the months since, and all of them had either been filed away through Solis's procedural machinery or, in two cases, backed down when compact defensive ships appeared on long-range scan. The council was losing face in corridors it considered its own. That was the thing that finally moved it. The vote to authorize a compliance action was 31-0. The compact had no seat to vote with. No one abstained. Moyose received the intelligence 48 hours before the council fleet crossed into Lethis corridor. She had a good intelligence network, built over 3 years from a combination of Theric Syndicate commercial contacts inside council space, a Gasari monitoring system that used their long route charts to watch traffic patterns, and 2 Earth analysts who had been quietly embedded in council-adjacent stations under false credentials and were very good at their jobs. She knew the fleet's composition: 4 heavy-class vessels, 12 patrol cruisers, 2 support ships. Under council doctrine, a compliance action was not a war. It was a law enforcement operation. This distinction meant the fleet's rules of engagement required it to issue warnings, attempt negotiations, and use proportional force. Osei did not intend to give it a war. She intended to give it a drain. She called her senior commanders to the briefing room on the Admiral's conviction. Her flagship, a name she had chosen herself, and that her crew found either inspiring or slightly ominous, depending on their mood. The room held 12 people. Osei stood at the front with a display behind her showing the council fleet's projected route. "They are not trying to destroy us," she said. "They are trying to make us stop. The political cost of this action back home is already high. 3 council members abstained from the public justification statement, which means there is internal disagreement. If we can make this action expensive enough and long enough, the political will breaks before the military does." She pulled up a routing map. "We do not fight them directly. If we fight their logistics." Contingency 7's military chapter had been written by a woman who studied asymmetric warfare. Conflicts where one side had more resources and one side had more motivation. The document's core argument was simple: a motivated smaller force fighting on home terrain against a larger force that needs to justify its cost to a political body back home has a structural advantage that raw numbers cannot overcome. The compact's advantage was that it knew every long route, every dead zone, every electromagnetic shadow and gravitational blind spot in 31 systems worth of unmapped space that the council had never bothered to chart because its highways went around all of it. The council fleet was moving on council roads. Osei was going to make those roads very expensive. And the first engagement happened in the Keth corridor, the same stretch of space where the Persistence had first found the Drev. It seemed right, Osei thought, that it started there. The council fleet's lead cruiser entered the corridor, expecting to establish a forward position. What it found was empty space. What it did not see until the compact's Gasari fast attack ships were already past them was a relay disruption in the corridor's navigational beacon network, something that required the council cruiser to spend 6 hours recalibrating its positioning systems and burning extra fuel to reestablish course. No shots fired, no engagement on record. The cruiser was just significantly delayed and significantly more expensive. This happened 17 more times in the first 3 weeks. Osei's fleet was a ghost. It appeared on the edges of the council force's sensor range and disappeared into the dead zones before pursuit was possible. It disrupted supply lines, navigation networks, communication relays. Every time the council fleet tried to establish a forward position, the position became untenable. Too exposed, too costly, too far from reliable resupply. The council's field commanders filed reports that used the phrase unorthodox tactics repeatedly, which Osei found mildly satisfying. But the council fleet kept coming. It was slower. It was more expensive. It was more confused. And it kept coming because the political decision had been made, and the political decision could not be reversed without someone admitting they had made it. 3 months into the compliance action, the fleet reached the Gassari home system, where the Gassari had been building for 40 years. Their home system, or what they had made their home system, since their original one was restricted, was not the kind of defensible position that military textbooks described, because it had been built for survival rather than defense. But it had something that strategic positions often lacked. Every single person in it understood exactly what losing it would mean. Siveri commanded the Gassari Defense Force from a ship called Long Memory, which was named with the specific intent of saying something about who the Gassari were and how long they had been waiting. She and Ose had worked out their coordination over 3 years of joint operations. Posture and their communication during the engagement was minimal. They had learned each other's thinking well enough that most of it didn't require speech. The battle for the Gassari system lasted 11 days. It was not a clean victory. The Council fleet was large and professional and fought with the capability of an institution that had been organizing military operations for 6,000 years. But the Gassari knew every gravity shadow and every radiation band and every navigational trick in that system, and Ose held the long routes in and out. And the Council fleet, at the end of 11 days, had lost 1 heavy cruiser and 4 patrol ships and had not managed to establish a single forward position that it could hold. It pulled back, regrouped, started again. The strike on the lunar shipyard came on day 42 of the compliance action. It was not a sustained bombardment. The Council fleet's rules of engagement prohibited civilian targeting, but it was a precise strike on the yard's primary construction facility designed to disable Earth's production capacity. 3 shaped charges, delivered by a long-range system that outranged anything the yard's defensive stations could reach. Kovac was on the construction floor when it hit. The first charge took out the ceiling of the primary assembly section. The second hit the drive fabrication unit. The third, the one that got him, hit the materials storage corridor he was walking through on his way to the East Wing, which was where he'd been going because Chen had called to tell him a support strut on the new ship's frame was reading wrong, and he wanted to see it himself. He was found 3 hours later under a collapsed section of corridor roof, with burns on his left arm and side and a broken rib, and the particular expression of someone who has just survived something they did not expect to survive. The medics wanted to send him to the Earth's surface hospital. He refused. He spent 3 days in the yard's medical bay, in a cot that was not different from the one he usually slept in, being treated for the burns and told repeatedly that he needed to stop moving. He was not good at stopping. On the second day, Chen came to give him the damage report. The construction facility was 60% destroyed. The drive fabrication unit was completely gone. The 4 ships in various stages of build were damaged beyond simple repair. Kovac listened to all of it. Then he said, "What fabrication units are still online?" Chen listed them. "In the East Wing? The one you called me about before the strike?" "Still standing," Chen said. "The support strut is still reading wrong." "That's still the priority," Kovac said. He discharged himself on the 4th day, went to the East Wing, looked at the support strut, and Chen had been right. It was reading wrong. And he spent 2 hours figuring out why and then fixing it. Then he stood in the middle of the East Wing and looked at what was still standing and thought about what could be built here. He put new plans into the system that afternoon, different ships than he had been building, built around what equipment survived, designed to work with the remaining capacity. He named the first new ship Luna. He wrote the name on the work order form without explaining it. Anyone who had been on the yard the day of the strike understood. Anyone who hadn't didn't need to. The order regarding Verith Station arrived on Ose's desk on day 67. Verith was a civilian way station at the edge of Lethus Corridor. Technically neutral, commercially operated, home to 40,000 permanent residents and a fluctuating population of traders and transit passengers. It was also, as Ose's intelligence network had confirmed 3 weeks ago, the primary fuel and resupply point for the Council fleet's forward operations. Without Verith, the fleet couldn't sustain its position. It would have to pull back to its own territory to resupply, a journey that would take weeks each way, and which the Council's political coalition would not survive. The war would end. The order from Earth's Wartime Executive Council was direct. Disable the station's fueling infrastructure. 1 precision strike. The residential sections were far enough from the fuel systems that casualty risk, per the attached military assessment, was acceptable. Osei read that phrase, acceptable, written in the careful language of a military assessment by people who were 2 light-years away and working from maps. She knew what the strike would do. She had run the calculations herself without being asked the moment the intelligence on Varath came in. She had run them to see how bad it was. And when the answer was that it was bad enough that she had not told anyone she had run them. The fuel systems were adjacent to the residential ring on one side. A precision strike was a statistical argument, not a guarantee. The assessment's acceptable was doing a lot of work for a very large number of people. She sat with the order for 6 hours. She had followed orders for 35 years. She had followed orders she disagreed with, and orders she found distasteful, and orders that had cost people their lives, because that was what being in a military chain of command meant. You trusted the institution, and you trusted that the institution's judgment, in aggregate, was better than any individual's. She had also, for 35 years, maintained a private opinion of where the chain of command ended, and where the institution's judgment stopped being better. This was it. She picked up her secure comm. "Commander Voss," she said. Voss was 3 systems over, running the Eastern Supply Corridor. "Admiral, I need mule convoy routes into Lethus Corridor. All of them." A pause. "Planning a blockade?" "Yes." "Varath?" "Yes." Another pause, shorter. Voss was 29 now and had been running convoys through hard space for 3 years. She understood things quickly. "I can have 6 mules in position in 18 hours, Voss said. "They'll need escort." "You'll have it." Osei put down the comm. She opened a response to the Executive Council's order. In the notes field, a field that would be included in the official record, she wrote, "Blockade of Varath supply infrastructure implemented in lieu of strike. A operational effectiveness equivalent. Civilian risk eliminated." She paused. Then she added below that, "We are not who they said we were." She sent it. The response from the Executive Council came back in 4 hours. It was not pleased. There were 3 messages in rapid succession, one formal, one less formal, one that was essentially a senior military official expressing emotion in writing, which was professionally unusual. She read all 3, filed them. The blockade went up. Amara was on the bridge when Osei sent the annotation. She was not supposed to be watching. She was monitoring communications traffic, which was her assigned station during operational hours, and she had not looked up from her console when the secure comm exchange happened. But the bridge was a small space, and she had her mother's ears, and she heard enough. She kept her eyes on her console. She thought about the order, about the strike that wasn't taken, about the 40,000 people on a neutral station who had nothing to do with the vote that happened on a planet they had probably never visited, going about their ordinary day in a cylinder of metal above a planet they called home. She thought about what Solus had said 18 months ago at the founding ceremony. "Ask me again in 5 years." She was watching the answer forming, watching it in the annotation her mother had added to an official military record, in writing, where it would stay. She was watching it, and she thought she understood. Varath's fuel supply was cut off. The Council fleet's forward position collapsed over the following 3 weeks. First the supply shortfall, then the operational window shrinking, and then the political support back home cracking under the weight of a compliance action that was costing more and achieving less than the original projections had promised. The fleet withdrew on a Tuesday. No ceremony, no formal declaration of anything. The ships turned and went home, and the Lethus corridor was empty again, and the Compact's convoys moved through it the same afternoon. Osei was on the bridge of the Admiral's Conviction when the last Council signature disappeared from the long-range sensors. She watched the display for a moment. She picked up her coffee, set it down again. "Now the hard part," she said, to no one in particular. Her bridge crew exchanged a look. They had learned not to ask Osei what she meant when she said things like that. She always meant them. They turned the ship toward home. The Council did not fall. This was the part that surprised the people who had expected a dramatic ending, a collapse, a final confrontation, the old order breaking apart under its own weight. That was the story that felt right, the clean version, the one with a clear before and after. What happened instead was messier and more human, and probably more honest. The compliance actions failure arrived at the council the way all failures arrive in political bodies, not as a single moment, but as a slow accumulation of cost. The fleet that came home was intact but depleted. The 3 council members who had abstained from the public justification statement were now 5. The minor members who had privately inquired about the compact were now doing so less privately. 3 weeks after the fleet's withdrawal, a council member named the Veth Collective, a small, were patient species that had held their seat for 800 years and spoken very little during most of it, submitted a formal motion to open negotiations with the compact. The motion was tabled. The following week, 2 more members co-sponsored it. The week after that, the primary committee's chair, the one who had moved the intelligence briefing to the top of the pre-session reading list, the one who had called the closed session that started all of this, sent a private message through a back channel that Solace's intelligence network intercepted within 12 hours. The message was addressed to the Earth delegation in exile. It said, "We would like to talk." Solace took 2 weeks before she responded. She spent those 2 weeks talking to every compact member, not sending a message and waiting for a reply, talking, in person or through the fastest available communication, in conversations that were real exchanges and not briefings. She talked to Sivari, who was already thinking 3 moves ahead and wanted to know what the compact's leverage was in a negotiation. She talked to Darvek of the Theric Syndicate, who had a list of specific demands in the particular controlled fury of someone who had been waiting 80 years to make them. She talked to the Velnos Elder through the translation system that was still imperfect but was improving. She talked to Kovac, who was running the Luna Yard's new construction schedule with his left arm still wrapped in medical tape, and who had one opinion on the question of negotiations. Don't give them anything they didn't earn. She talked to Osei, Eno, who had one opinion on the question of negotiations. Don't let them set the terms. She wrote down everything, not to synthesize it into a single position, but because she needed to know what she was walking in with, whose interests, whose history, whose 40 years of exile and whose 300 years of being ignored, and whose 11 weeks of lying on a cave floor learning to listen. Then she responded to the message. She agreed to talk. The conclave chamber of Valhalla was unchanged. 300 meters of living crystal, dark stone floor, the architectural intention of making everyone feel small. Solace had stood here 15 times now. She knew the chamber's acoustics, its sight lines, the specific way the light came down from the crystal and made everything below it look slightly luminous. Because she walked in ahead of her delegation and took a moment, just at the entrance, to look at the room. She thought about the first time she had stood here, the first time before any of the 14, when she was a junior delegate and someone else had spoken for Earth, and she had sat in the gallery and looked up at the crystal and felt very genuinely that she was in the most important room she would ever be in. She thought about the 14th time, the vote, the 31 in favor. Then she walked to the table. The council's lead negotiator was a young Velharan named Sereth, young by the standards of a long-lived species, which meant he was approximately 90 years old by human reckoning. And he had been selected because he was a reformist and because he was junior enough to have no personal investment in the decisions that had been made before he was politically active. He was visibly nervous. He was doing a creditable job of not showing it. Sully settled into her chair with the calm of someone who had made her decisions before she entered the room and was here only to deliver them. The Council is prepared to offer Earth full membership reinstatement, Sereth began. Trade route access, communication relay access, medical synthesis license renewal, and retrospective compensation for economic damages incurred during the suspension period. He paused, clearly expecting a response. Solace said nothing. He continued with the slight acceleration of someone filling silence. Additionally, where the Council is prepared to open a formal review of several existing classification decisions, including the Drev classification, with a target resolution timeline of 12 months, Solace said. Sereth stopped. I'm sorry. The Drev classification review. 12 months, not the standard timeline. Sereth made a note. That's possible, yes. Good. Solace opened the folder she had brought. I don't want Earth's seat back. The chamber was quiet. Sereth looked at her carefully. Delegate Solace, I want 12 seats, she said. one for each compact species that has never held council representation. I want those seats created as full member seats, not combined, not second tier, not subject to review. Full seats, equal votes. She set a page on the table and slid it toward him. No, the species list is on the first page. Sarath looked at the page. His expression was carefully neutral, which told Solis that he had been briefed on the possibility of this and had not quite believed it would happen exactly this way. I also want Article 1 of the Compact's founding document written into the Council's charter, she continued. The language is on page 2. It is 28 words. I have not padded it. He read it. No member may classify another species as presentient. The capacity for thought and language is presumed until demonstrated otherwise. The burden of proof rests on the classifier, not the classified. Amending the charter requires a supermajority vote, Sarath said. 22 members in favor. Then I suggest you count, Solis said. Among the 5 members who co-sponsored the Veth Collective's motion are a starting point. I have spoken with 7 others who have expressed interest privately. You have 17 days before the Theric Syndicate's senior representative presents his own terms publicly, which will be considerably less convenient for the council than mine. Sarath was quiet for a moment. You've been planning this, he said, not accusatory, almost wondering. I've been planning this for 5 years, Solis said, since the first time I walked out of this room. The negotiations took 4 months. They were not easy. The charter amendment was the hardest. It required Solis to spend 6 weeks doing what she had done in council-adjacent space, traveling from member to member, while making the case in specific terms that were relevant to each species' specific situation. She did not make a general argument. She made 22 particular arguments, each one different, each one built on something real. The Drev's presentient classification was formally expunged in the Chamber's crystal record on the 8th week. A junior council archivist spent a full day entering the correction into the historical record, which the crystal encoded in a layer of new growth that would be visible for as long as the chamber stood. Darvik attended the expungement session. He sat in the gallery, the members' gallery now, with a full Theric Syndicate seat, and watched the archivist work. Afterward, he said nothing for a long time. Then he said, 80 years. Solis, sitting next to him, waited. No, 80 years of filing complaints, he said. 80 years of submitting motions. Every one of them filed correctly with the right forms and the right citations and the right language. He paused. They were always right. They just weren't enough. They were also not alone, Solis said. He looked at her. Every complaint you filed, every single one, is in the council's archive. I read them all. They are part of the record of what happened here. They will be in the crystal as long as this room stands. She paused. You were here before we were. You held the door open. Darvik was quiet for a long time. 80 years, he said again, but differently. Kovac came to Velhara for the formal session. He wore his work clothes because he had not brought anything else, which caused a brief administrative discussion among the session's protocol staff, and then was resolved when OC's aide pointed out that dress code enforcement was not covered in the current negotiating framework. Kovac sat in the technical observer section and watched the chamber fill with 31 original members plus 12 new ones, plus the Vel Nas environmental support equipment in a special section that Kovac had quietly inspected the morning before and declared structurally sound. He looked at the 12 new seats. They had been installed by Velhara's own construction crews, which was correct. The council chamber was the council's to modify, but Kovac had requested, through an unofficial channel, to see the engineering plans for the installation. He had read them, noted 2 potential structural concerns, and sent his notes to the construction team lead. Both concerns were addressed in the final installation. The seats held. He sat in the observer section and thought about what it meant to build something that held. Not just the seats, but all of it. The mules that were still running their routes. The Luna Yard that was 3 months from finishing the first post-strike ships. The 11 treatments that Earth's labs had developed from scratch and that the Compact now produced for species that needed them. He thought about the drive schematics the Gassari had shared with him. He thought about what happened when you put Gassari speed and Earth's fuel efficiency and Drev navigational memory into the same ship design. He thought, That's the next thing. He would tell Osei when he got home, and he had a feeling she was already thinking the same thing. Amara asked Solace the question on the last day of the formal session, while the chamber was emptying after the final charter vote. 24 members in favor of the amendment, 7 against, 4 abstentions. Not the unanimous endorsement that the reformist faction had hoped for, but solid enough that the hardliner bloc was now clearly the minority. The chamber's crystal ceiling was recording everything, as it always had. Amara found Solace near the entrance, standing where she had stood 5 years ago before walking out. She looked like she was looking at the door, or the room, or some private version of both. 5 years, Amara said. Solace turned. You said ask you again in 5 years, Amara said. So, are we the council now? Solace looked at her. Went a real look. Not the diplomat's flat face, but the actual face underneath. No, she said. Amara waited for the rest. The council classified the Drev as presentient because their cognition tests looked for minds that thought the way council minds thought. Solace paused. Every institution that becomes powerful enough eventually does that. It starts building tests that confirm its own assumptions. It stops being able to hear languages it didn't invent. She looked at the crystal ceiling. What we built, the compact, the charter amendment, the new seats, none of it guarantees we don't do the same thing eventually. Institutions drift. Power changes the thing that holds it. So how do you stop it? You build in a door, Solace said. You build in a way for the institution to be changed by people who are inside it and people who are outside it, without having to burn it down first. She paused. The 11 pages, short enough to change. That was the design. Amara thought about that. What if the people inside it don't want to change it, she asked. Then the people outside it need to be loud enough and organized enough and patient enough that the inside can't ignore them. Solace almost smiled. It takes a while, but it works. She touched the wall beside the door, the stone of the chamber, smooth and old. We're the thing that reminded them what they were supposed to be, she said. Ask me again in 50 years. I want to know if we remembered it ourselves. There was no ceremony at the end, no parade, no speeches, no formal declaration of victory. The session ended. People filed out. The delegates went to their next meetings, their next routes, their next problems. Petra Voss was already 3 systems away, running a convoy that included the first compact medical supplies cleared to move through council-managed trade routes under the new framework. She was 31 years old and she had no plans to stop running convoys anytime soon. The Dogged had been upgraded twice, and she had named her second ship Persistent, which her crew understood immediately. Sivari was flying long memory back toward the Gassari home system. The restricted zone designation had been lifted, pending formal restoration proceedings, and she had 40 years of absence to think about on the flight. She thought about it. And then she thought about the new courses she was going to file through the council's route registry. The long routes that her people had been flying, charted now in detail, submitted for the official record. Let them know the roads existed. Darvek submitted the first formal motion of the Theric Syndicate's new individual membership, a proposal for a review of commercial licensing practices in zones adjacent to inhabited systems. It was filed correctly, with the right forms and the right citations. It was given a standard review timeline. It was also filed by a full member, with a full vote, with 11 other full members co-signing. The review timeline was accelerated. The Drev delegate returned to their moon. Adeyemi, Dr. Yuki Adeyemi, now the head of Earth's Compact Xenobiology Division, traveled with them. She had been learning to communicate in chemical memory for 5 years. She was still not fluent. She sat in the cave systems and worked on her vocabulary, which was slow work and which she did not mind. The Drev showed her a new memory. It was a memory of the founding ceremony in the cargo bay. The room, the delegates, the smell of different species and different worlds, the quality of the light, and then, running through the whole memory like a thread, something she did not have words for but felt when it touched her skin. She asked the translation system for the nearest equivalent. It took a long time. Then it said, something like recognition, or the feeling of being heard. She sat with that for a while. Then she wrote it into her notes because it was part of the record, and the record was important. Edose was the last one to leave the chamber. She was not sure why she stayed. She had no remaining business there, no meetings scheduled, no obligations. She stood in the empty room after everyone else had gone and looked at the crystal ceiling and the dark stone floor and the 43 new seats and the amended charter plaque that had been installed on the wall beside the entrance. She was not given to sentimentality. She had filed that capacity away a long time ago, the way you file away things that cost too much to carry. She let herself look for once. She thought about the 9-year-old folder in her desk, about the woman who wrote it, the game theorist who had died before Earth ever joined the Council, who had spent her life doing the math on what a species needed to survive on its own terms. About the margin note, if they ever make us leave, make sure leaving was their mistake. Osei had spent 5 years turning that sentence from a hope into a fact. It had not been clean work or quick work, or the kind of work that looked like heroism while you were doing it. It had been early mornings and maintenance reports and convoy schedules, and one order she didn't follow, and a blockade that ended a war without a strike she couldn't authorize. It had been Kovac, with burns on his arm, naming a ship after a shipyard. It had been Voss asking a gassery captain if she needed food or fuel first. It had been Solis lying on a cave floor, learning to listen with her skin. No, that was Adeyemi. Solis had done other things. She had read 9,000 pages and used them as a key. It had been Amara, asking the right question twice. Osei looked at the crystal ceiling. Why, at the light stored in it, layer on layer, every word ever spoken in this room. Her question was in there somewhere now, filed and recorded and permanent. No, not hers. She had not asked a question here. She had sent a 2-word message from a small room on a ship going home and let Solis do the talking. What was in the crystal was Solis's voice. What do you call a species that develops language you cannot hear? 31 species had sat in silence above that question. Now 12 more had seats to answer it. Osei walked to the door. She did not look back. She was not the looking back type. She had a shipyard to check on and a conversation with Kovac about those drive schematics and a quarterly fleet assessment that was not going to read itself. The door opened. Light from the corridor. Behind her, the crystal ceiling kept growing. A few centimeters per century, it had time.